just to reiterate what Dr. Gary was saying about, I can't touch on everything, but there's other very important aspects of health, and we practice what's called functional medicine, so we look at the whole organism, the whole function of the person. And digestion is very important, so if you have digestive problems, that needs to be looked at and fixed. That's really important for your immunity. Sleep, as he mentioned, is an inflammatory, sleep apnea is an inflammatory problem. It's huge. We see it all the time. If you don't get your deep wave sleep, your REM sleep, your body can't recover. So these things really need to be looked at, as does everything else. These are all subjects for other lectures. So now we're going to go into the brain. So this is a simplistic drawing of our brain. This is, so we have the reptilian brain, which is the primitive brain. Then we have the limbic system, which a lot goes on there. The neocortex, that's our higher thinking. A little more detail on the limbic system. So we have the hippocampus, which I mentioned before. It has to do with memory. We like that. The amygdala is the part of the limbic system, the organ that actually fires when there's it's fear and aggression. So if there's a crisis or an urgent situation, the amygdala is going to fire up. The hypothalamus and pituitary produce a lot of hormones that stimulate other endocrine glands. So what happens when you have a crisis, the amygdala fires, your sympathetic nervous system, your fight and flight goes into action, as opposed to the parasympathetic, which quiets everything down. If the stress keeps on going, then you have your hypothalamus, pituitary, stimulating your adrenals that produce cortisol and adrenaline. And so that's the feedback. So cortisol, it does increase with age. It causes a rise in blood sugar and blood pressure and inflammation. Eventually your adrenals can get kind of burned out if you have chronic stress. You can get extremely, have chronic fatigue. It causes all those inflammatory aging diseases. So there's a term called allostatic load that's been studied in research. And allostatic load, if you have this chronic stress situation going, and this can be from, it actually causes wear and tear, this chronic stress on the body and aging. So you can, examples of allostatic load that can occur as trauma would be like post-traumatic stress syndrome, or someone that's experienced abuse or neglect. But then all the other things that Dr. Gary had mentioned, with that exposures, illnesses that can increase this allostatic load, can lead to excessive cortisol and adrenaline, and can lead to brain inflammation. And also the hippocampus, that memory center, can deteriorate because of this chronic inflammation. You can experience excessive anxiety, leading to disease, illness, and accelerated aging. So there's a psychology term called negativity bias. I don't know if anybody's read Dr. Rick Hanson's books, Buddha's Brain and Hardwiring Happiness. So great, fantastic books. He talks a lot about the negativity bias. So the negativity bias came about when our ancestors needed to be very hypervigilant about the saber-toothed tiger around the rock. So they couldn't afford to be smelling the flowers. They had to be aware of everything that was going on around them. So we've carried this through to the present situation, the current, contemporary situation. We don't need to have this negativity bias. I mean, we have to be, aware, but we don't have to constantly be worrying about everything. So we're wired to worry. This causes a lot of angst. So it leads to depression, anxiety, worry, hypervigilance, and then accelerates that allostatic load. So what Dr. Hanson recommends in his books, and as Dr. Gary had mentioned also, the self-compassion, but also, so the negativity bias, by the way, is 5 to 1. So we have 5 positives go by, and we latch onto the 1 negative. So your boss gives you a stellar performance review with 1 critique. What are you going to think about that critique, right? So we're constantly like worrying about that one thing. This occurs in relationships too. It's a 5-to-1. You have to have 5 positives to 1 negative for a relationship to actually maintain. You can't have a relationship that's 5 and 5. It's just not going to last. So some tools that we can use to decrease this allostatic load, the self-compassion, really noticing the positives and letting it sink in. This is my grandson, and if I look at him, I will forget everything I'm going to say, so I can't even look at him. But he just slays me. So this is what I do. Every day I'm FaceTiming, and he just, yeah. So savor the good, children, babies, family, hugs, pets, animals, flowers, nature. You know, all of this, there's so much good stuff that's happening, and you really want to feel it. And what Dr. Hansen says is 5 to 20 seconds. You want to let it sink in, and this will actually, neuroplasticity, this will actually change the brain. Also meditation. So this is other things that you can do. You can also do gratitude journal, like write down. We have our meetings every 2 weeks, and Dr. Gary makes us say 2 things we're grateful for. We moan and groan, and then we say it, and it's actually good for us. It's like eating our broccoli. So also tuning out the news. I mean, you know, just limit the amount of news that you watch, because they are geared towards negativity bias. Do you remember that Time magazine, you know, silent killer, you know? And that's how the news is geared, so it can really be anxiety provoking. So just limit the amount that you read or watch. Also, use your prefrontal cortex. So if some crisis occurs, step away, give it space, and then come back and just reassess it. So the prefrontal cortex inhibits that amygdala. So I want to mention, this is the Grant study. This was a study that was started in 1937, I believe. They started to follow about 280 sophomores from Harvard, males, and they followed them through their life. This is actually one of the subjects. And it was basically following like human development. And there was one psychiatrist, George Valiant, who wrote a couple books on it. He followed them, and he interviewed them every few years, most of the time. So there wasn't one major conclusion, but there was a few points that I think were important. One of them, on the negative, was that alcoholism was devastating to health and wellness. On the positives, there were some interesting points, like education was important for longevity, and formal or otherwise. Just the desire to learn is important for longevity, and also playfulness and creativity. So keeping playfulness in your life, and doing something creative. You don't have to be talented at it, but just like my mother started. In her 80s, started piano lessons, and she loves it, you know. And I think that is wonderful, and that's what we need to do, you know, be playful and creative. And the other question they asked them, one question that I liked was, what have you learned from your children? Now, or your nieces, nephews, or somebody from the next generation. So those that were bitter about change and just, you know, were kind of stuck in the past did not do so well as those that embrace the future generations and being open to those, to your children and grandchildren and nieces and nephews, and really learning from them. So there was a study that was a paper that was published by researchers in Germany, and they were linguists, and the myth of cognitive decline. This caught my eye. Okay, so basically, and I'll just summarize it because basically they said that when they analyzed the way older people process, they process slower because they have a lot of information to go through. So it's not that they're declining, it's just that they have a lot to process. So an example would be someone who is a younger person who's bilingual. And it might take them longer to process because they have to go through 2 languages. So my kids went through French immersion when they were in elementary school, and when they transitioned to the English schools, they literally for years said that they had to translate, even in math class, they had to translate from French to English in their heads. And so it took a little longer. So this is a good thing, myth of cognitive decline. Now, it doesn't mean that we can't use some memory tools, and I actually gave you some memory tools from a Harvard publication, things that you can use, and they're really helpful. So I said to my husband, I said, so if you're parking, and so you don't forget where you parked, like for example, if it's 3B, you imagine 3 Bs in your car. And he said, well, you could just also take a picture with your iPhone. And I'm like, that works too. Okay. So the future, well now in future, is they're using genome sequencing for treating cancer. And there'll be more to come. So since the Human Genome Project, where they sequence human genomes, they've actually determined there was only about, I think, 25,000 genes. So now they're studying microbiome. So microbiome, you love this, is the collective genome from the microorganisms that live in and on your body. And you have 10 times as many microorganism cells as you have cells in your body. So you are all bugs. But this is very exciting. They're collecting this data for better probiotics, treatment of gut disorders, but also it's really going to be really exciting in the future of medicine to study this and to see how they contribute to wellness, to improving, taking care of diseases, and how different the microbiome is in disease states and in healthy states, basically. So in conclusion, in summary, we've discussed nutrition and lifestyles in relation to how we can decrease the inflammation, the inflammatory diseases of aging. We talked about neuroplasticity and the neurophysiology, how we can change our brains to think to be happier. We discussed the importance of social connectedness and the future trends in longevity. I also attached a recipe for delicious gluten-free bread that's full of nuts and seeds. It's really, I have tasted it myself, so it's really good.